This is audio lecture, U.S. History 102, lecture 24. The time frame we're looking at is 1933 to 1938. This lecture deals with how Roosevelt deals with the Great Depression through his program known as the New Deal. The President, Mr. Roosevelt, recognizes that Hoover had been inefficient in calming the average American and in restoring confidence in the economy, so as President, he focuses first upon this. It is reported that much of the success Roosevelt has during the Great Depression is centered around his own personality. We have this thing called the cult of personality. Some people have it, some people don't. The majority of people do not have this. Certain people noted throughout history would be Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler, FDR, pardon me, Winston Churchill. These types of people have such a charismatic personality that it comes over, you want to follow them. It's an interesting thing. So, he is the first president, this is FDR, to make regular use of the radio, addressing the voters through something called the fireside chats each week in an effort to express, in simple terms, just what his administration is doing to help them during the Great Depression. On March 6th, just 2 days after taking office, he issues a proclamation which closes all American banks for 4 days in what would be known as the banking holiday. The banking holiday helped to prevent people from taking their money from the banks and end inflation. On March 9th, he sends to Congress the Emergency Banking Act, which was meant to protect the larger banks from being taken down by the collapse of the smaller banks, and allowed for the Treasury Department to inspect the solvency of each bank before it could be reopened. It also allowed for the government to reorganize the banks most needed. Congress passes the act with almost no debate. The banking holiday and the Emergency Banking Act helped stop the panic in the banking industry, and within 3 days, approximately 3/4 of the banks reopened, with over $1 billion of hoarded money poured back into the banks within a month. The same day he sent the Emergency Banking Act, Roosevelt sends to Congress the Economy Act, a bill designed to convince the public and business community that the federal government was in safe and responsible hands. Excuse me. The Economy Act balanced the federal budget by cutting wages of federal workers and reducing pensions by up to 15%. Currently, I don't think we could do this. I'm pretty sure the union would prevent any type of act along this line, but I could be wrong. Congress passed it almost at once also, though in the long run it would slow the growth of the economy marginally. Later, in the spring of 1933, FDR signs the Glass-Steagall Act, which gives the government the authority to curb irresponsible speculation by banks. What we mean by that is they get to guess about what's going to be profitable and what's not. That's speculation. The Glass-Steagall Act also establishes the FDIC, which would guarantee bank deposits up to $2,500. This is important because even if a bank failed, the depositors would get at least some of their money back. This was something that did not happen prior to the Glass-Steagall Act. The Truth in Securities Act of 1933 requires corporations issuing new stocks to provide full and accurate information about themselves to the public. In 1934, another act formed the Securities and Exchange Commission to police the stock market to prevent people from taking advantage of others. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of May 1933 allows the 7 basic commodities, those would be wheat, cotton, corn, hogs, rice, and tobacco, and dairy, would impose limits on their production. The government would then tell the producers how much to manufacture and pay them subsidies for not producing. Now understand, the government is paying people to not produce things. A tax on processing, think of making corn into off the cob, or processing a hog to turn it into bacon and ham, would provide the funds for the subsidies, so the government doesn't have to pay any money out. Excuse me. Gross farm income increases by half during the first years of the New Deal, and in the 1930s it is good to be a farmer again. However, in January of 1936, the Supreme Court strikes down several conditions of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, saying the government has no constitutional authority to limit how much food a farmer could produce. Remember, I have told you all this before. The government has the ability to pass any law it wants. It's not until it's challenged and deemed to be unconstitutional that we as the public have to stop using it, stop following it. So, part of this act is deemed unconstitutional. Roosevelt is worried because of much of the New Deal legislation has similar language to what is in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. However, Congress passes the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act a few weeks later, which allows the government to pay the farmers to conserve soil. So it all works out in the end, because Roosevelt still gets them to stop producing things, and it helps stabilize the market. Now, for industry, Congress passes the National Industrial Recovery Act in June of 1933. The act is ran through a bureau known as the National Recovery Administration, and it's headed by a man named Hugh S. Johnson. Johnson creates a series of codes, which creates a minimum wage between 30 and 40 cents an hour, a maximum work week of 35 to 40 hours, and an abolishment of child labor. Understand, before this, kids could work. 2-year-olds, as soon as they could walk, they could work. The intention was to prevent companies from lowering prices or wages to gain an unfair advantage in a volatile market. He demanded, and we're talking Johnson here, he demanded production and employment levels be maintained. Nearly every industry leader agrees. Of course, it helps when you're backed by the federal government. One of the things that the codes allows for is collective bargaining and unions. Unions begin to pop up around the country. Unfortunately, the codes did not have any wording to enforce collective bargaining, so the unions are kind of more symbolic than anything else. In 1934, the NRA is publicly criticized. This is not the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration. It's publicly criticized, and then in 1935, the Supreme Court rules that Congress has illegally given too much power in drafting the NRA to the President, and strikes it down under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Roosevelt, FDR, is very angry about this. Another area which receives aid under FDR was at the local level with the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Association. The TVA would build dams and bridges, along with bringing electric power to low-income regions in the Tennessee Valley to thousands of residents. It would improve water quality and bring jobs to thousands of workers. FDR's favorite program was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. They create camps in national parks and forests. Young, unemployed men from the cities worked on such projects as planting trees, building reservoirs, helping the national parks, and improving agricultural irrigation. Mortgage relief is also part of the New Deal, and by 1935, fully 1/5 of all farm mortgages have been refinanced under the Farm Credit Administration. Even with their efforts, 25% of farmers lose their farms by 1934. In 1937, Congress would then establish the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, to insure mortgages on new construction and home repair loans. The New Deal, and by proxy FDR himself, is highly popular for the first 2 years of his presidency. After the first 2 years, however, the critics really begin to pile on their public criticism, even going so far as to refusing to say Roosevelt's name in the halls of Congress, referring to him simply as that man. We have something similar to that today in our politics. People refuse to acknowledge Trump in certain areas. Now, as far as opposition, Roosevelt does have his fair share of people who don't like the New Deal, those who believe that he is going too far with his laws and actions. Unfortunately, he is highly popular, and the only way to destroy popularity in the 1930s, or in today, is to destroy a reputation. With that in mind, in 1935 we see the Whisper campaign begin. This is championed by those of the utility corporations, hurt by the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Association, and the cheap power it produces. Stories of Roosevelt being a drug addict, that he is insane, and that he can't go anywhere or do anything without first consulting a psychiatrist are everywhere. Some people believe that Roosevelt was simply taking too much power for himself and accused him of fascism and communism instead of protecting freedom. And yet none of these people mention anything about his handicap, being in a wheelchair. One problem is that the New Deal doesn't have a clear set of directions on how it's supposed to progress. In many ways, Roosevelt is just he's kind of winging it. It is seen as too progressive for its time by some, and different organizations developed to combat Roosevelt's obvious kingly ambitions. One organization is called the Liberty League, and it is established in 1934. They argue that the New Deal attacked free enterprise and is distinctly anti-Roosevelt. At their prominence in 1935, they have over 125,000 members. However, when Roosevelt is re-elected in 1936, they will disband. Communists and socialists are equally critical of the New Deal, with the loudest voice belonging to Huey P. Long of Louisiana. This man is elected governor of Louisiana in 1928 and successfully eradicates any political eradicates any political opposition in Louisiana and maintains overwhelming support from the population. He builds roads, he builds schools, he revises the tax code, he lowers the rates of electricity and water. At the end of his term, state law prevents him from running for a second time, so what does the governor do? He runs for Congress. At first, Huey P. Long supports Roosevelt in the New Deal, but quickly changes his position to a redistribution of wealth program he calls the Share Our Wealth program. He claims that the government could end the Depression easily by using the tax system to confiscate the surplus riches of the wealthiest men and women in America and distribute that surplus to everyone else. Every family would receive $5,000 to an annual wage of $2,500. He begins his own political party, the Share Our Wealth Society, which gathers a lot of support throughout the nation. Remember, he is a progressive. His message is very similar to that of the current socialist Bernie Sanders. To combat the growing threats of his presidency, FDR launches a second New Deal in 1935. One of the first things to occur in 1935 is the raising of taxes to the highest and most progressive in peacetime to that point. Further, the National Labor Relations Law is established, also known as the Wagner Act. It creates the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, which would force companies to recognize unions. With the NLRB industrialists, who had been largely behind the Whisper campaign against Roosevelt, they lose the ability to control many of the government policies regarding labor relations. The NLRB promotes a new type of organization called industrial unionism, in which workers at a company join together rather than just in a profession like electricians. So understand, everybody at the factory joins together, not just the electricians or the carpenters or whatever. The new labor unions include everyone. I'm sure they limit, people like Asians and African Americans because of the era. But this is what it's supposed to do. To combat, let's see here, we already did that. The United Auto Workers come to be the largest union in the mid-1930s. They employ what is known as the sit-down strike, in which the workers show up and simply sit down, refusing to leave even when arrested, preventing the company from using strikebreakers. The largest strike occurs in February of 1937 with General Motors and 17 of their automotive plants. The strikers ignored court orders and the local police. When the governor refused to send in the National Guard, GM relents and recognized the union, becoming the first major auto manufacturer to recognize the United Auto Workers, the UAW. Steel workers organized into the Steel Workers Organization Committee, or the SWOC, which would later become the USWA, the United Steel Workers of America. In March of 1937, U.S. Steel becomes the first company to recognize the union rather than risk a costly strike. However, a smaller steel company called Republic Steel, on Memorial Day of 1937, saw their workers strike and demonstrate in Chicago. When they attempt to march on the plant, police opened fire upon them, killing 10 and wounding 90 others. This is known as the Memorial Day Massacre, and in 1937 the strike fails. It's very difficult to strike for your beliefs and opinions when you're getting shot at, and things are done slightly differently in Chicago in the 1930s. In 1937, there's an estimated 4,700 strikes, and over 80% settle in favor of the unions. By the end of the year, over 8 million workers are unionized. By 1941, there are over 10 million union workers. Concerning other areas of relief, Roosevelt's champion he is the champion for and recipient of the Social Security. Excuse me. In 1935, the Social Security Act establishes two types of assistance. Assistance for those who were unemployed and homeless, who could receive $15 a month in federal assistance. The other type is a pension system to which both the worker and the employer would contribute with the intention of providing a small income upon retirement. The intended payment in 1935 for Social Security was between $10 and $85, depending upon contributions throughout your lifetime until retirement. Broad categories of workers were excluded from the program, such as domestic servants, think of your maids, and farmers. But it establishes the first federal pension system. Unemployment insurance was also a part of the Social Security Act, along with aid for disabled persons. The framers of Social Security wanted to create aid, not welfare, and many people argued that it has lost its way in modern day. In 1935, the Workers' Progress Administration, or the WPA, is founded and is responsible for building around 100,000 buildings, 600 airports, laying 500,000 miles of road. We get over 100,000 bridges. The WPA keeps over 2.1 million workers employed during the Great Depression. In 1936, Huey Long is assassinated in September of 1935. In the presidential election of 1936, Roosevelt wins with a sizable majority over the Republican candidate, and the Democrats increased their numbers in both the House and the Senate. It would be decades before the Republicans would rebound and begin to win elections. After his re-election, FDR decides that it's time to do something about that pesky Supreme Court. In 1937, he proposes an overhaul of the federal court system, which includes adding up to 6 new judges to the Supreme Court. Roosevelt's real purpose behind this is to appoint new, liberal judges and change the balance of the court. The court realized that their position is in jeopardy and really don't bother FDR much after this event. And this concludes Lecture 24.